Question 7 asks, is there conflict over child contact? It's important to consider what contact is currently in place and is this a means for continued abuse. Does the abuser threaten to report the victim to social services, threaten to kidnap the children, threaten they will apply for custody? Are there any official orders in place regarding child contact and have these been adhered to? Question 8 asks, does the abuser constantly text, call, contact, follow, stalk or harass the victim? Note the word constantly in this question. Stalking is often initiated following separation, but also happens within relationships and may manifest in obsessive policing of the victim's movements. Stalking is not only calls and messages or following in person. Behaviours are not always ostensibly malicious and include unwanted sending of gifts or letters, making contact on anniversaries, birthdays, turning up unannounced at home or work. Abusers may enlist others to conduct stalking behaviour or use children to obtain information about the victim, such as new relationships, activity and new addresses. Question 9 asks, are you pregnant or had a baby within the last 18 months? Pregnancy is known to increase risk of harm and physical violence may be initiated for the first time in this period. Assaults are more commonly targeted towards a victim's stomach area during pregnancy. Risk of harm to the unborn child or new baby needs to be considered. If separated, an abuser may use contact with the child to continue abuse. If the victim is pregnant, note in the comments when the child is due, as this needs to be factored into safety planning. Question 10 asks, is the abuse happening more often? Consider if the frequency of the abusive incidents are greater than previously. Remember, this question relates to all forms of abuse and not just physical abuse. When was the last incident? How many incidents have there been in the last 12 months? This will give you an indication of how frequent the abuse is happening. Question 11 looks at, is the abuse getting worse? Is the most recent incident worse than the last? If so, in what way? Consider all forms of abuse and their severity. For example, has controlling behaviour extended into more areas of the victim's life? Has gaslighting increased? Was there once one mode of abuse and now there are multiple? Has the physical abuse caused more injury? There may have been a gradual escalation over time, so consider historic incidents in relation to recent ones. Question 12. Does the abuser try to control everything that you do, and is he or she excessively jealous? This can be answered yes if either or both elements of behaviour is present. Common indicators of excessive jealousy and control include accusations of infidelity, police and victims' movements, statements such as, if I can't have you, no one can. Question 13. Has the abuser ever used weapons or objects to hurt you? Note the word ever. This is important to capture any incident which has involved weapons or objects. This includes household objects such as mobile phones, ashtrays, etc. being used to harm the victim. Write these incidents in the comment section with approximate dates if the victim can recall them. This question can also be used to ascertain if the abuser has access to any weapons. Question 14 asks, has the abuser ever threatened to kill you or somebody else and you believe them? Include threats sent by text, email, social media. The crucial element to satisfy a yes response is that the victim held the belief that the abuser meant the threat and or was capable of carrying it out. Consider that threats may come from multiple individuals in cases of honour-based violence. The victim will know the abuser well, so it is important to ascertain their fears. They may minimise the threats. Question 15. Has the abuser ever attempted to strangle, choke, suffocate or drown you? Note the question asks for any of these incidents, not restricted to recent ones. This includes hands around the throat, attempts to smother, use of objects to attempt strangulation. Ascertain when these occurred and any injuries or loss of consciousness. Question 16 asks, does the abuser do or say things of a sexual nature that make you feel bad or that physically hurt you or someone else? It is important to ask this question to a victim, no matter how uncomfortable it might make us feel. Victims are more unlikely to volunteer this information of their own accord unless they are actually asked the question. Victims may not appreciate that sex without consent constitutes rape and may have normalised any sexual abuse. It is important to determine if consent was present. Sexual abuse does not just include rape. but can also include the victim feeling pressured or coerced into sex, the use of weapons, revenge pornography, unwanted touching, refusing to use contraception, using insulting sexual terms, any forced sexual activity with others or prostitution, and it is important to document any forms of sexual abuse that have been taking place. Question 17 asks, is there any other person who has threatened you or of whom you are afraid? It's important to establish who is threatening the victim, as there may be more than one abuser living with the victim. We see this a lot in honour-based violence cases, where it may also be siblings, parents, wider family members, or even the wider community putting pressures on victims. This can also occur in cases where the perpetrator may be part of a gang and the victim may have further people threatening them. It's important to document who's threatening the victim and of whom they are scared of. Question 18 asks, do you know if the abuser has hurt anybody else? Consider if the abuser has hurt previous partners or family members, and if this is current or historic. If this constitutes a past history of violence, some victims may be intimidated by the perpetrator and may be reluctant to share this information with a professional. Knowing that the abuser has hurt people can inform further risk assessments of if the perpetrator is a serial domestic abuse perpetrator. Question 19. Has the abuser ever mistreated an animal or family pet? Sometimes perpetrators would harm or attempt to harm family pets as another form of control and intimidation. It can also be used as an indicator for the potential for future violence. Question 20 asks, are there any financial issues? Are you dependent on the abuser for money? Have they recently lost their job? Are there any other financial issues? This is important as this may be a barrier to prevent the victim from seeking help or leaving if they are being financially abused. Consider whether there are language barriers. The victim may be new to the country and not know their entitlement to benefits. Does the victim have recourse to public funds? Are they entitled to access benefits and housing? Are there any debts that the victim has as a result of financial abuse from the perpetrator? Question 21. Has the abuser had problems in the past year with drugs, prescription or other, alcohol or mental health that has created problems in leading a normal life? What is called a toxic trio is when domestic abuse, substances and mental health are all present. It's important to consider if the perpetrator has had any problems in the past 12 months with substances or mental health. Document what substances are being used or what mental health issues are present. Have these been formally diagnosed? How do these affect the perpetrator's behaviour? Is the abuse worse when the perpetrator is using substances? Question 22 asks, has the abuser ever threatened or attempted suicide? This is important because the perpetrator may use coercion, threats to hurt him or herself if the victim leaves, contact the police or other services. If a perpetrator is suicidal and has attempted suicide, it opens the risk to consider as a professional familiar homicide and whether this is something that the abuser may be at risk of. Question 23. Has the abuser ever breached bail, an injunction or any agreements from when they can see the victim or the children? Document what orders have been in place in the past and what has been breached. This gives an indication of the perpetrator's propensity to adhere to court orders and bail conditions, etc. Consider the level of any breaches. For example, was it what some people would call a low-level breach where they've sent a text message, or did they attend the property and assault the victim? Question 24. Do you know if the abuser has ever been in trouble with the police or has a criminal history? Again, note the word ever. This question looks at the criminality of the perpetrator and their criminal history. Not all victims may know the answer to this question, but it is important to document what the victim is aware of. This may lead to further disclosure needing to be made if the victim is not aware of a perpetrator's history. If as a professional you are aware that the perpetrator has a criminal history, you can add this into the comment section later. You've now reached the end of the risk assessment questions. Count the number of yes responses and record the total at the bottom. The last box on the referral form is for consideration by professional. This is your opportunity to record any further information you have that you've not already recorded on the form but pertains to the risk. This could be in relation to vulnerabilities, if you feel the victim is minimising the abuse, if the victim has refused to answer any questions or any other concerns you may have. It can also be useful to record any information in relation to the perpetrator that's known, such as access to weapons or firearms. What does the perpetrator do for a job? Does this give them unique access to weapons or an opportunity to continue abuse? Are they in a job where they work with vulnerable people? This can all add to the risk for the victim as well as the wider public.